Now, if you're going to embark on the journey of making a John Hall frame, you're going to want to be comfortable with making ebony plugs. And honestly, that could have been a whole nother article in and of itself, so we thought this would be a great topic to do in the form of video to show you exactly what you need to do to get them just right. Now, the ebony that I use typically comes in the form of a turning blank, and most of the time it's covered in wax. So when I get it to the shop, I scrape off some of the wax and I joint two faces, and then I take it over to the bandsaw and trim it into little strips. And those strips are then drum sanded to the proper thickness, and then I can cut them down into these little sticks. And each one of these corresponds to one of the pegs of the Hall frame. Of course, I have some extra material here as well. Now, the real trick with this, once you have them cut into these sticks, is how to pillow those ends. That's really the hardest part, because if you don't get that right, it's just going to kind of look funny. It's not going to look as smooth and clean as it could. So let me show you what I do. Now, the method I use is adapted from Daryl Peart's method. What I decided to do is leave out the first step, and he builds a jig to go on the disc sander that allows you to create the rough shape, basically your very first step. I just use a piece of 120 grit sandpaper to do that. I suppose if you make a lot of this stuff and you do a lot of Greene Greene, you're going to want to have one of those jigs on hand. But if not, you know, this seems like a reasonable way to do it if it's a one-off project. If you get Daryl's book, I would really recommend that you do. It's very good. You'll see details on how to build that jig. For now, 120 grit paper on the bench is the way I'm going to do it. I start by basically holding the ebony stick like a pencil, and I give sort of back and forth motions. Turn it 90 degrees and do the other end. Now, if you want, I have these platine abrasives. Mirka makes abrasives like this. It's basically a foam abrasive pad. I use those underneath the sandpaper sometimes just to kind of give me a little bit of extra cushion and help with the rounding over. Now, what we're looking for, if you look very closely on here, you'll start to see your scratch marks develop, and you start to see that you're leaving little chamfers on the ends. You don't really want that. You want it to be a smooth transition to make a nice little hump all the way over. So that's what you're looking for, is your scratch pattern to be nice and even all the way across. You also want to sight this way along the tip to make sure that that line is even all the way across, so you don't work one end more than the other. So this needs a little bit more work. So once it looks smooth and even, now we can go into a circular motion. And what I'm doing is just basically think of yourself as drawing a bunch of circles on a piece of paper, but notice that the angle is changing as I draw those circles. So once you're satisfied with the overall shape, switch to the next grit. In my case, it's going to be 180. And you could use the circular motions again. You could go back to the straight motions, whatever you're comfortable with, but always end on that circular motion. Okay, now we're on 220. Okay, so now I'm going to move up to an abrasive pad. This one is 500 grit. These surfaces are very, very helpful for creating that nice, soft, clean, pillowed look. 1000 grit. 2000 grit. And if you have it, 4000. Now, if you're so inclined, you could even take it over to a grinder outfitted with a polishing wheel and buff that surface to a mirror shine. Smooth as glass. Now, I use this very simple cutting jig. It's a piece of plywood and a back fence that you basically rest the strip on. You could even use a pencil here to draw a line so you can cut them to the same length each and every time. And I've got a little kerf cut here that my saw blade fits into perfectly. And this is how I cut it. And the fine teeth of the saw blade are perfect because they won't really tear out that ebony at all. And I trim it to be just a little bit short of the depth of the hole. If you're brave, you could trim it so that it's exactly the depth, and that way you could bottom the peg out when you tap it into place. I never quite have that much faith in myself that I'm going to get it perfect, so I make it a little short. Okay. And there is your ebony plug. Now I like to cut my pegs just a little bit oversized, so in both dimensions it's about a 64th over. And that way when I put the actual peg into the hole, it kind of pushes right up against those edges, wedges its way in there, and gives you a really nice tight fit. Now in order to do that, we actually need to create a little bit of a wedge shape on the bottom part of that peg so that it can go in. Otherwise, trying to squeeze this in, you'll just damage the wood grain. So I just use a chisel and I go freehand, just be as careful as possible, and I take some nice little paring strokes on some sort of sacrificial surface to trim it up. I'm going to show you using a very large piece as an example, so hopefully you'll be able to visualize it better than if I used my 1/4 inch piece, which is the one I'm actually using for this demo. So with a nice sharp chisel, you just want to push it up against the side and carefully remove some material from each end. Okay. And work your way around. Doesn't take much at all. And that will give you the wedge shape that you need to tap it into place and get a nice tight fit.
I place a good amount of glue into the hole and insert the plug. A few taps with the plastic-headed hammer give me a plug that sits just proud of the surface. And believe it or not, that's all it takes to make a beautiful Greene Greene style ebony plug.